Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Trinity, and I am the event assistant at the Woodlawn and Pope-Leighey House. Our historic site is located in Alexandria, Virginia, and is home to two iconic properties. The Woodlawn Plantation, which was originally, sorry, my computer decided to freeze, originally part of George Washington's Mount Vernon, and the Pope-Leighey House, a mid-20th century house designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. In celebration of the 80th anniversary of the Pope-Leighey House, we are hosting a series of talks with professional Frank Lloyd Wright enthusiasts and architect experts. Before I introduce today's presenter, I would like to quickly go over some housekeeping for this virtual event. Please be aware that this session is being recorded, and if you have your camera on, your image may be shown in future promotional materials. During the discussion, we ask that you keep your microphones muted so everyone will be able to hear the speaker clearly. We will have a Q&A session at the end. You should see the chat button at the bottom of your screen, where you can type questions you have during the presentation. If you would like to jump off mute to ask a question during the Q&A session, either let me know in the chat or click the raise hand button and I will call on you to unmute your mic. Now, I am happy to introduce Ashley Wilson. Ashley is the Chief Architect at the National Trust for Historic Preservation, an endowed position named the Graham Gund Architect. She oversees the conservation and preservation of architecture and landscape for 28 historic sites. With 30 years of experience as a preservation architect, Ashley specializes in modernizing and stewarding significant historic buildings to make them relevant within the modern environment. Before working at the Trust, she was a tenured professor at the Clemson University College of Charleston Graduate Program for Historic Preservation in Charleston, South Carolina, and in private architectural practice. She graduated from the architectural schools at the University of Virginia and University of Notre Dame. Thank you, Ashley, for joining us.
Thanks, Trinity. And you can hear me, right?
Yes.
Good? Okay, great. So I'm Ashley Wilson, and it is a beautiful day here in Alexandria, Virginia. You should see Pope-Leighey behind me, even though I am presenting from my home in Alexandria, which is just miles away. And so Trinity and I are both employees of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, which is the owner and the operator of Pope-Leighey House. And we were chartered in 1947 by Congress. And what's interesting is in our charter, it says we are here to support the nation's historic sites, buildings, objects of national significance, and to facilitate participation in their preservation. So we were actually created to take on house museums because there is really nowhere else in the Park Service that did that. So that is sort of our roots. Today, we are a much broader organization where we have an excellent legal department working on advocacy and government relations. We have a magazine. A lot of people know us through our grants department because we give preservation grants. And we like to emphasize that, preservation is a tool to reflect on current events. And we do that through some of our initiatives, such as the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund and the 11 Most Endangered list. And I had to laugh, and we use this slide at the beginning of a lot of our presentations, and we used to have 9 field offices, but now that the National Trust employees have been working from their homes for the last 12 months, I would say we have like 130 field offices because we're all throughout the country. So I hope many of you have actually been to Pope-Leighey House and had the chance to visit. And those of you that haven't been there, the first sort of surprising thing you will learn or discover when you go is that it shares a site, which is Woodlawn. And Woodlawn is actually the National Trust's first site that they acquired in 1951. And it was 2,000 acres sort of behind Mount Vernon that Martha and George Washington gave as a wedding gift to their granddaughter, Nellie Custis, as she was marrying Lawrence Lewis. And it's designed by William Thornton, the nation's first architect. And on that site, sorry, next slide. There's actually many, many layers of what's going on. It has this overlapping history. So if you look, let me see if my mouse right here, this is the William Thornton Woodlawn mansion that's in the center of the site. Pope-Leighey is located to the north of that. So it's this black little block right here. But it also has so that called a country estate era, which it had an owner in the 20th century named Elizabeth Sharp, and she built a lot of buildings on it. So we have, for example, this is a garage and maintenance shed that she built to house her horses and her automobile at the time. And it has a layer of Quaker history because the Quaker Meeting House is adjacent to our property. And then there's some housing that's connected to the Quaker community. So there's a lot going on at this site. And then I have to say that any discussion of Pope-Leighey House is indebted to the research that has already been completed by Stephen Reese. And he was a previous lecturer in this series. And he wrote this book that I certainly reference to put this together. And all of us who are familiar with Pope-Leighey reference and use, it's excellent. And then I also use a lot of the HABS, Historic American Building Survey. So that's where I looked for my research on this. And also, even though I haven't been to the office in a year, I really was looking into the National Trust Archives to sort of see what was happening in the Historic Sites Department with the addition of Pope-Leighey into our portfolio. So what I'm going to do today is basically a broad social cultural narrative of the house and all of its owners, and then sort of the National Trust legacy as an owner. Many, make sure I'm in the right place. Okay, so here we are, the Pope-Leighey House. So just the basic facts, it's designed in 1939. It was built in Falls Church, Virginia in 1940 to 41. It's 1,500 square feet. It's a Usonian, and its modesty is what makes the building really resonate. So the basic materials, it's red cypress, it's got brick, it has concrete floors, it has glass windows. The building feels incredibly warm. You know, if you put it into context of what is being built at the time, you know, most Americans are sort of looking at the colonial past. So living in homes that look like colonial Williamsburg, or their little diminutive Mount Vernons, or even diminutive Woodlawns. So they're looking sort of at the great estates and building smaller versions of that. And then this house in comparison, you know, it has no ceramic tile, it has no wallpaper, it has no plaster, it has no moldings, nothing covers the basic construction. It's very honest. And then also consider the context that in 10 years from when this is built, 1940, you have sort of the arrival of true Bauhaus mid-century modern, which is a very different ethic. So the first owner is Lauren and Charlotte Pope. And Lauren Pope is, he's a reporter he's a reporter for, I'm getting his paper's name right now, which is amazing to me. Anyway, I'll come up in the next slide, but he is a reporter and he does it, and he's heard of Frank Lloyd Wright, he's very famous, and not that impressed with him or not thinking that much of him until the, well, actually, I'll go back to it. What you might know Lauren Pope from is he wrote a book that is still used. He wrote, besides being a reporter for the newspaper, he wrote a college admissions book that is still being used today. So people like me who have kids growing up go to it because it's sort of about why you want your kid to find the right fit for the school. But that's what he was known for besides his reporting. So he first gets interested in Frank Lloyd Wright when he reads the Time magazine that comes out in 1938. And he takes from that magazine, he goes back and he reads the autobiography, which came out in 1926 and it was republished in 1932. And in that Time magazine article, there's a quote by Frank Lloyd Wright that says, "The house of moderate cost is not only America's major architectural problem, but the problem most difficult for her major architects." And it's really, so Frank Lloyd Wright's sort of at the end of his career, or he's in his 70s. And Lauren Pope is in his 30s. But in his 70s, and he's coming through the Depression, this is 1939, sort of brought out these ideas because up until now, he's really been working like most architects have under commission, so working for wealthy clients. And so he started to really think about this after the Depression. And he's never really been engaged until this time to build into sort of low cost affordable houses. So these types of houses, the Usonians, they're all small. They're between 1,000 and 2,000 square feet. Many of them now are actually much bigger because they have been expanded on. But it comes from, I've heard two things. I've heard that the word Usonian comes from a British author, Samuel Butler, and he uses it to reference it. But I've also heard that it's sort of an amalgamation of these words. United States of North America gets mixed up to mean Usonian. But it's modest, well-made, affordable. And it's also all about sort of how you live within the building. It's good living, good conduct. It's about beautiful rural space. And then also the term, and I have to know, I've heard this term most of my life as an architect, organic architecture, and I just never really thought about it that much, or I really understood what it meant until I read a quote that Edgar Kaufman Jr. wrote, and he wrote it, I'm gonna read it to you because it's so good. And he says, you need to compare it to organic architecture. And it means perpetual flow. An organism is interwoven and overlapping, so it continually gives to and receives from the outside world in order to maintain identity and develop and generate new organisms. So sort of the concept of what's in the building is affected by the outside, and it changes both the inhabitants within as they absorb the outside world. So the first Usonian was built in Madison, Wisconsin, 1936, 1937, the Jim House. And they all sort of have a kit of parts. And so once you've been to one Usonian, you sort of see this kit of parts used and reused, which is listed here.
I can't detect a camera.
And then it's not open floor plan the way modernism does as you move into like the Farnsworth House. You still have rooms and still has formality, but it's open in how we live today, which is sort of the living room and the dining room spaces together. And it goes back to Frank Lloyd Wright's insistence that we shouldn't ape what the wealthy were doing by imitating little mansions, but we should have our, these smaller low-cost houses should have their own grand thing, and it's rooted in nature. And it's very American in the sense of the abundance of that nature and living within it. And you think about Frank Lloyd Wright, and he was raised in Wisconsin and he grew up in Spring Green. So that was his background. And then the next slide is just showing you the inside of 4 different Usonians, so you can sort of see the flavor of the kit of parts. So after Lauren Pope reads the article, and he is a writer for a living, and he recognizes from all that he knows about Frank Lloyd Wright that he's a man of a big ego, he writes a letter to him, and this is the most famous quote that's related to the building, but he writes a letter that basically pleads to his ego that says, I really need this, is this something you would consider building for me? Dear Mr. Wright, there are certain things a man wants during life and of life, material things and things of the spirit. The writer has one fervent wish that includes both. It is a house created by you. Will you create a house for us, will you? And he says yes. And so the first one that's designed for Pope-Leighey House is 1,800 square feet, which he can't afford. He has a very limited salary. So he actually gets a second design, and this one is for 1,500 square feet. And part of living in these tiny houses that the architect demands is that you have to adopt the lifestyle to go with it. And so he says, my clients, they're asking me for a $5,000 house, but they really want a $10,000 house. So for you to fit your life into this tiny house, you're going to have to be willing to get rid of your stuff, and that you're going to have to adjust to the house rather than putting all your things in with it. And this image is of the bigger Pope-Leighey house, the first design. So here it is in its original location in Falls Church, Virginia. And then because none of us have the honor of being there, I'm going to give you a quick tour of the building. So what we're looking at is the entranceway at the end of the stairs at the end of the access. You have the compressed entranceway, and then you open up into this large, expansive fireplace hearth living room with a dining room right next to it. And here's another picture of the dining room. You can see the kitchen's this little tiny tucked away corner across from the dining room. And then you walk down this little narrow hallway to the children's bedroom. And then in the children's bedroom, next door to that is the parents' bedroom, which is the room on the left. And then this is a image of the kitchen on the right. So the Pope family moves in and they love it. Lauren Pope loves it, and he loves it so much, and he's a writer, and he uses his writing as a tool. He actually sends an unsolicited letter to the House Beautiful magazine talking about how much he loves his house. And House Beautiful actually holds it. They don't publish it because Frank Lloyd Wright is still considered so controversial because of his own personal life. And they also find modern architecture as controversial. So they finally publish it in 1948.
Ashley, I'm going to interrupt you just for 1 second. We're having trouble here. The Zoom quality is less today. Would you point your mouth toward the microphone for the most part? It's just the Zoom quality for some reason. Thanks.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Thank you for telling me. Here. Okay. So after that's published, then the Laurens, can you hear me better? Let me know if you can hear me better. All right. So after it's published, the Laurens decide to sell the house. And then you're like, why would they sell it? They love this house. And he's totally bought into the philosophy of living there. And part of it is that I think it's sort of a COVID reaction too, is the Lauren Pope and his wife, they moved to a farm out in Loudoun County. It's 300 acres, and they want to live a more natural life and be part of it. And their whole plan is that once he gets established and has his writing career out there and he has the kids out there, then he'll have Frank Lloyd Wright design him a bigger house on this other property. He also is starting to outgrow the house because he has 2 children living in here with them rather than 1. But one thing I wanted to bring up is I think the house actually has a lot of tragedy for him, in the sense that when they move in, they have their first child, Ned, their firstborn son, and he actually passes away on the outside of this house in a little stream or body of water that's right there. And so I feel like the house has a sad place for them, and they're ready to move on for many reasons. So he puts, there's the paper he works for, the Evening Star. So they put an ad into the Evening Star to sell the house, and they find pretty quickly they find a lot of interest in it, but they end up selling it to Robert and Marjorie Leighey. So that's owner number 2, and they lived there for even longer, from 1946 to 1964. And this couple is really interesting. They had actually, they're sort of primed for an interesting architect in a modern building. They had hired previously Julian Berta, who was a DC architect doing sort of modern housing. So this is one of his apartments in the middle. They had commissioned him to do a house, but they never actually did it because he moved to Richmond rather than staying in DC because he was working as a patent officer. But they come back to DC when they buy the Pope-Leighey house. And they're both outdoorsmen. They're both avid golfers. She's an avid gardener. They're marksmen. They do marksmen's competitions together. And one thing about Robert Leighey that a lot of people don't realize is that he actually only has one leg. One leg has been amputated. And as I mentioned, Marjorie is a gardener, and she spends a lot of her time. She didn't feel like the outside of the house was that attractive, even though Frank Lloyd Wright designed sort of a hemicircle around it. She felt like she could do a lot more. So she's spending a lot of time bringing wildflowers into it and really working on the outside rooms and creating extra rooms outside of the building. And she is so into the architecture that she hires Rose Greeley, who is actually the first licensed female architect in DC, an incredibly talented woman. She's not just an architect, she's a landscape architect. She's fascinating. Her father is an Arctic explorer. She's trained as an artist, besides an architect, a landscape architect. She goes to Smith, she goes to Cambridge for her architecture school. She apprentices in Fletcher Steele's office in Boston. And then she moved to DC And she has over 500 commissions in her sort of portfolio. Many of them you know about: the Aberdeen Proving Grounds, the Brazilian Embassy, the Friends Meeting House in DC, Army Navy Country Club, and even Los Pope-Leighey Historic Inn in Albuquerque, New Mexico, she's worked on. But so she works with Ms. Leighey on the garden design outside of their building. So one of the things I think would be sort of interesting to explore more is the lens of mobility issues in Pope-Leighey House, because I find it so interesting that they lived here and there was, I mean, he was super active, but that somebody who had a disability was living in the Pope-Leighey House. But unfortunately, he had complications from his leg, and that causes him to pass away in 1963. And so this comes on sort of suddenly. And in that last year, when they're alive and dealing with his illness, sort of things are starting to happen around them. They're starting to see stakes in the ground with ribbons on them, and neighbors are all talking about a highway that's coming and that they're going to do an eminent domain and take away the property. And Miss Leighey actually, they discuss it, and they don't think it's going to actually happen. They think it's just rumor. So there, I wanted to go and sort of go back into what's going on. So Robert dies in 1963. In 1956, 10 years before, 8 years before, the Federal Highway Act under President Eisenhower is passed, which is making the highways part of the defense system. And so superhighways are being built all around the country without consideration of wildlife or historic places. So the preservation and the environmental movements are sort of throttling up in 1966 when Robert dies. And there are two legislative victories that happen. One is in 1966, the Department of Transportation is established under President Johnson. And that is where you see Section 4F, which is now Section 106, but that you have to take in consideration sort of wildlife and historic sites when you're using federal money to build. And then, of course, you also have the National Historic Preservation Act in 1966 that, again, is sort of saying that you have to have some preservation protocols in place for federal money. But as I said, they had discussed it even though they had nothing solid. And one of the reasons that they never thought that anything would happen to the property, oops, let me go back. I'm trying to get my mouse in to come in. Here we go. Is, okay, so this red star right here, this is where the house is on the end of Locust Street. And this blue star is the headwaters of 4 Mile Run, which runs all the way through Falls Church down into the Potomac right by Ronald Reagan Airport. So this big blue stripe right here is actually 4 Mile Run today. So why they didn't think that this would be built is because they didn't think that they would underground 4 Mile Run, which is exactly what they did. So right now 4 Mile Run is pushed off to here. Okay, so how does this all come together? Like, how did we start saving this? So it's mostly due to this woman on the left, Terry B. Morton, and she is a 27-year employee of the National Trust. I've only been there 8.5 years. So she's been there, and she does all other publications. And she is married to a preservation architect named M. Hamilton Morton. And he is the chair of the AIA HRC Historic Resources Committee in the American Institute of Architects. And the two of them, they're both artists, and they're very active in preservation all over the DC area. So Hamilton Morton is a member of the Northern Virginia Fine Arts Association. And the Northern Virginia Fine Arts Association now is located at the Athenaeum. At this time, it didn't have a location, but they were doing tours. So he pulls together a tour of the 3 Frank Lloyd Wright houses in the Maryland, DC, Virginia area. And they go on a tour, and at that tour, they talk to Mrs. Leighey about what's going on. And she has just gotten over this year where her husband's passed away, and she is in so much denial about losing her house after she loses her husband that she has gotten the condemnation papers in the mail and she hasn't opened them. She's sort of pretending like it's not going on. So they listen to this, and the next day, Terry Morton goes to work at the National Trust, and she tells our president of the National Trust, who was Garvey at the time, what is going on. And he was, before he came to National Trust, he was the head of Old Salem in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And then we basically get a publicity campaign. So everybody at the trust finds out about it, and then Terry calls her friends, or really her counterpart at the Park Service, who does the publications for the Park Service, and he doesn't name himself, but he starts writing letters. And then they start a letter writing campaign to the governor of Virginia. The AIA is writing about it. Northern Virginia Fine Arts is writing about it. And then Northern Virginia Fine Arts actually makes the proposal, say, hey, if we could get the building, maybe we can use it as our headquarters, and maybe we should look at moving it. Lauren Pope finds out what's going on, and so he writes a scathing letter into the Washington Post, and he says that, you know, this highway is vandalizing art in order to move the Pope-Leighey house. And then sort of incredibly, a young National Public Radio culture desk reporter named Susan Stamberg interviews a young Huell Newell Jacobson architect about the plight of what's going on at Pope-Leighey house. So you're starting to get press in every direction. And then finally, Miss Leighey actually writes directly to Secretary of the Interior, Stuart Udall, and asks if there's any way that she could donate the house to the Park Service if she could have lifetime tenancy. And Secretary Udall, believe it or not, is sort of all in. And he says, and this is a quote from him, that he's going to practice the fine art of living room negotiations. And he invites all the press in the highway department to the house to discuss what the options are. And this is a photo of all of them at the house discussing what to do about the highway and moving of this house. And they recognize that it's actually too late to change the highway department's plans. And so that they're really stuck with having to relocate the house. And at this point, they start looking all over the region to the different sites. And so they're looking at parkland that Fairfax County owns, they're looking at parkland that the National Park Service owns, and they look at one National Trust site, Woodlawn. And then I want to take a minute to sort of go back and talk about Stuart Udall as the Secretary of Interior. He, like Rachel Carson, wrote a book, The Quiet Crisis, that matches her Silent Spring. That was sort of all about sort of the environmental movement and what was going on. He is the secretary under Kennedy and under Johnson. And he has an incredible legacy of what he was able to accomplish. So if you look at the slide, just under 4 million acres of land he acquires into parks and monuments and recreational sites. He saves national sites. He does wildlife refuges. And this is a picture of him and Lady Bird Johnson. So everything's moving off in a good direction. And this is so when I'm going through the archives of the National Trust and Historic Sites Department, you realize like everything in preservation is controversial. We actually have a whole notebook of people who wrote in saying that they were against it. And so I'm just going to read the second half of this. I think the National Trust would do a lot more for America in safeguarding Mount Vernon than in fussing over one house belonging to the very modern and controversial Frank. So I said, we have a pile of these. People felt like we were not, it was not time well spent. But it moves forward. So the money that the highway department gives to Miss Leighey, $31,500, formalizes her acceptance, and she gives it to the National Trust, and then they deed it to us. And they picked our site because it actually has the woods in a way that they felt like they could put it back onto the landscape, that it would look most like where it's coming from. And I love this quote on the bottom by the Secretary of the Interior. It was she who enabled the right hand of the government to rescue from its left hand. So again, though, when you go into our archives, you find that the National Trust is actually a little bit cynical about it. Our notes in our records say, quote, "The house is of no historical significance, being only 22 years old and occupied by only 2 families." And so when I was looking through the files, I found it really interesting that we were almost complacent about it. Like the general attitude by the sites departments that were discussing it was, well, sure, like if they're going to pay for the move and we will maintain it, we have the land and that's fine. But there wasn't the conversation that I was expecting of how important the building was, and they really want to show the craftsmanship. They seemed to really understand the educational value of the building, but they weren't looking at it through the historic lens that you would expect them to. So the house has actually moved 14 miles, pretty much due south of where it is, from Falls Church down to Alexandria. And because there's no direct route and they had to go over so many bridges and there's so many overland electricity wires, they decided they had to dismantle it to make the move. And to do so, they hire William Wesley Peters, who is the architect at Taliesin, and he was actually one of the first apprentices at Taliesin, and he's married to Frank Lloyd Wright's daughter. And I think we should discuss sort of the whole custom of moving. I think it's actually a very American custom to move buildings because we're frugal and buildings get moved all the time. But preservation, which is still sort of new and coming up, it is not something we do often. In preservation, you always try to tie the building to the land, and it's still looked down upon to move the building. So we work it basically where we take the land and we pay the delta in the price between what was given for the condemnation money and what's pulled together. William Wesley Peters is the architect in charge, and then the Park Service helps out too by creating Historic American Building Survey drawings and photographs of the building, and they also provide some architectural services. So in the Habs collection, you see the drawings, and then here are some of the photographs. And this is before the move.
Ashley, you're cutting out just a bit there, in and out again. So I don't know if everyone caught that part, but.
Okay, so this is Historic American Building Surveys, photographs of the house before the move. And then because the house had to be moved in pieces, they basically kept some of the pieces they could together, but then all of the masonry doesn't go. So they dismantle some and number it and do it that way. They keep some pieces together that they can, and then the masonry stays behind. And then it's very well documented. So it's just showing sort of the different ways of it's moving and being dismantled. And then, as many of you probably know about, it was sort of controversial because when they re-site it at Woodlawn, they don't cite it exactly the way it was cited before. And I was actually surprised to Mrs. Leahy, who lives in it again after it's done, because she's given lifetime tenancy. But they cite it a little bit different, yet and it's still a wooded site. And then they dedicate it. And it's sort of hard to imagine today that all of these people would come to the dedication. But so Gordon Gray is the head of the National Trust at the time, chair of the board. Edgar Kaufman Jr., whose family owns Falling Water, writes and speaks at it. And then the Secretary of the Interior shows up for the dedication as well. Meanwhile, Mrs. Leahy, she was a mission, so she's moving to Japan and she is not here, but the plan is when she comes back, she'll live at the house. And what I find really fascinating is that even at the time that this is done, people are making these comments that Woodlawn, the house itself, is elegant and affluent, but it's a house of privilege. It's a shell, it's an artifact. Where Pope-Leighey House is the counterpoint. It's beauty and truth, and it's the examined life. So here you have two American houses that one is already looked at is so different of a past to the Pope-Leighey House, which is the Every Person's building. And the other interesting sort of counterpoint to 1964 is the National Trust is onboarding 2 properties in the same year, Lyndhurst, which becomes our 7th property, and Pope-Leighey House. And both of them are the first properties the National Trust owns that aren't somehow connected to the revolution, the founding of the country in the Revolutionary War. And they're both basically famous for their craftsmanship and their architecture and the architects that built them. So you have Alexander Jackson Davis, and probably one of the more important Victorian buildings in the country, and then you have a Frank Lloyd Wright building. Okay, so the third owner is us, the National Trust. So it's 1964 going, we still own it into today. And we always joke that if you want to live forever, you should give a property to the National Trust, because whenever we give life tenancy, then people do live forever. Philip Johnson gave us the glass house and then lived until he was 99 years old. And then Marjorie she was here from 69 until 1983. And how she worked it was that she would live in the house during the week, and then on the you probably can all hear my dog. And then on the weekends, they would have tours. And immediately they started having problems. For such a small home, it has big problems. And I don't think the National Trust is actually doing very great maintenance anyway, but the floors were starting to crack. And then in the files you read notes about, they were complaining that as she got older, she was keeping the heat up, the floors have radiant heating in it, and she was keeping the heat up so high that that was causing the cracks. But alas, that is not the reason the house was cracking. The house was having all sorts of structural issues, because even though they did all this work to recite it, they didn't do any geotech soil studies, and they put it on heaving marine clay, which is pretty common as part of Fairfax County. And so they decided they have to actually move it again. So this image is showing, and it takes us until the 90s to study it and decide that we actually have to move it again. And they don't move it very far. You think they move it farther, but they only moved it 40 feet. So the green line is where it was originally, and then the black lines is where it goes. So it just gets pushed back farther in the site. And then these images are also showing sort of how close it is to, so the construction is where it's going, and then the house itself is where it was. And so I just want to point out, for the second time, this house is being totally dismantled, and the masonry is being discarded. But the only thing they're keeping really is the wood as they move it. So here are some images of the second one where they're reconstructing all the masonry work, the floors, the chimney masses, and they're moving the rest of it in the same way. They're dismantling and bringing it back together. And then in all the construction photos, you can see what bad shape the house is actually in due to our lack of maintenance, or the lack of maintenance throughout. I mean, the house has been built twice. And so again, here's some more images of sort of how, as they were adding steel to hold things up, and all the wood that they were rotting, all the wood that was deteriorating that they were having to replace. Okay, so as a recap of sort of all the statistics, it's commissioned in 39, completed in 41. It cost around $7,500. Sold to Robert and Marjorie Leighey in 1947 for $17,000. Frank Lloyd Wright dies in 1959. They move it because of the highway, Route 66 in 1963, and it cost $31,500 to move it. It's reconstructed at Woodlawn, 1964 and 65. It's open to the public later that decade. And then it's moved again in 95, 96 for over $700,000. And it's designated a landmark in 1970. So now we're basically like, what's the legacy of this building? And for the National Trust, it kickstarted our whole modern collection. So we have the Pope-Leighey house, but we also have the Glass House and the Boyer House and the Farnsworth House. And it's really interesting, when they were looking for what to do with Pope-Leighey House, one of the suggestions was to give it to the Smithsonian, and they could have it erected at their museum on the mall. sort of like the Boyer House. The De Boyer House was designed for MoMA in New York City, and it was in the courtyard there. And then at the end of the exhibit, it moves out to the Kikit, which is a Rockefeller property. But we only have 28 properties, and I think these 4 actually are some of our strongest. So it does start our collection. But when I think back of sort of what is Pope-Leighey, what's its legacy sort of in the preservation world, one of the things that makes me question the most is sort of the whole concept of authenticity, because we have rebuilt so much of it. I think there's actually less than 50% of original material in this building, maybe 40%, somewhere between 40 and 50%. And yet the building is as powerful with or without that as its recreated version of itself. I think it's interesting as a counterpoint that preservationists are only saving rich people's homes, because it's definitely showing a shift into much smaller buildings that are important for their architecture and what they're saying about how the American is living. It pushes the 50-year guideline, right? Because historic buildings are recognized as old historic at 50 years, and this building was not even close to that, and everybody recognized the importance of Frank Lloyd Wright and having Usonian. It really pushes the limits of decoupling place and buildings, because it really, with preservation, it's sort of the last resort. If we can't, we rather have our buildings on the site that they were built for, but here it is, we move it to a totally different site. The orientation isn't even the same, and yet it's still a very powerful building. And I think this is something with all the flooding and climate change adaptation that the country is looking at that we're all going to be facing again. It certainly tells you a lot about the power of preservationists knowing each other, because this was basically like I called my friend and they called their friend and we made things happen. And that's, I think, preservation community is very small and very tight, and it's always been that way. And so the power of what happens when preservationists work together, you can save a lot of things. It exposed the lack of legal means to save buildings. And because of this, like Fairfax County launched their review commissions, and they started surveying what was actually historic, where without surveys, you don't know what you're going to affect. So I think it put in play a lot of preservation sort of standards. But I think at the end of the day, the most important thing about Pope-Leighey is that, well, how about this? When you walk, I love Woodlawn, don't get me wrong, I am an architect, I love Woodlawn, I love its details, but when you walk into Woodlawn, sort of at best, what you conjure is maybe Nellie Custis sitting there in front of the fire, needle pointing with the enslaved people helping her out. But when you go to Pope-Leighey House, you can actually feel like you can live there, and you can understand the stories of the people who live there and what, honestly, tragic lives. I mean, the first family lost a child, the second family lost their husband, and yet they still love this building and they still live these really honest lives. So there's something about Pope-Leighey, its size, its scale, that just makes us all feel like we belong and we can live here. And so it ends up being a really perfect, like if you're gonna own a Frank Lloyd Wright building, I think having a Usonian and having this Usonian is the best building you can have, because it is all of our buildings, because it expresses all of our human lives. And with that, I will open it up to questions.
Trinity, is your computer back up? We lost her there for a moment.
Yes, it's working again. Great. Well, thanks. If anyone has any questions, just add them to the chat or use your raise hand feature and let me know when you can get off of mute. But for now, actually, we do have a few questions that have come in. So first, how does the trust use the house today? Are they open to flexible programs beyond house tours?
Yeah, I love this because we have, yes, okay. They have the standard house tour, and even in COVID, they're having a standard house tour, and they have really creative programming where they've done dinner theaters and they use it for meetings. But when I researched Pope-Leighey House and I realized how often, okay, well, first of all, it was lived into, somebody lived in this building until the 80s. And so it makes you think, why can we not use this more flexibly? There's not that much authentic material. There's not, it's been moved so many times that I feel like we should be pushing the envelope of what we do here. beyond what we're already doing. Like, I feel like people really should be able to experience it. I would love it. We have at Glass House, we have a relationship with Neiman Marcus where you can rent the Glass House for $40,000 a night. I think it would be cool if you could do something like that at Pope-Leighey House, not for 40, but a better number. But I feel like it's a house that would be even more powerful if people could experience it overnight.
Great. So going back to the feature slide, there is a vertical structure just to the right of the windows and the left of what looks like it might be a TV. So they have a question about what was in the photo on one of your previous slides.
All the way back. One thing I'll pose while I still have people here is, Frank Lloyd Wright is such a gifted architect and clearly was a sustainable architect. And so I've been trying to figure out, so my job to manage these buildings is how we can, we've added air conditioning. Like it wasn't built with air conditioning, and we've added air conditioning to it. So I've always wondered, like, can it be solar? Is this a good property that we should be trying solar on? Like, it's a property that's been rebuilt so many times. This is a good place to try something. And I know people who love Frank Lloyd Wright wouldn't want us to change any of the details, but I do wonder if this is like the right property for the trust to either put solar panels, maybe on the flat roof, maybe around and in the landscape, but that we should be looking at more sustainable systems as we maintain it. And if I've really scared you, you need to write us in because I need to hear all the complaints. And I'm not sure which image. This one, maybe? This one? What'd she say, Trinity? It looked like
I believe so. It was on the features slide. There's a vertical structure just to the right of one of the windows. And looks to the TV. Yep.
Yes, this is it.
This one.
So, I don't know if Peter's here with us today. It's a light, right? That's a light. And we have an imitation one at Pope-Leighey House. Let me see if I can get my mouse to work. I think they're talking about this.
I think so.
It's a light fixture. And I am pretty sure the one that we have at the Pope-Leighey House, Peter might have designed for us.
The answer to that is yes. Peter Christensen built the light in Pope-Leighey.
Hi, Amanda.
Hi.
Another one that we got in was, why was the orientation of the house changed?
I think the topography of the site, and I didn't allow us, which I have Stephen's images of it. And then you would think, okay, should they move it again when they, right? Because they moved it twice. It's like they could have done it right the second time. But I think the way it actually fits on this site with the hills, because it's sort of up on the crest. Here we go. So see how much it's turned. So here it's, the bedroom wing is basically 45 degrees different, right? And when Marjorie Leahy moved in, she complained about it because she was like, oh my gosh, like, once you live in one of these properties, you sort of get used to how the sun rises and the reflections on the walls and of the designs and how that shines through. And so she was seeing the house in a totally different way. And she didn't like it very much. But I think on our site, we actually have fairly steep hill here. See, steep bank. It's all worked out. So it gave us, in how you entered it, I think we just didn't have the flexibility to move it. And then I think once people got used to it this way, now it seems normal. I mean, that's the weird thing about preservation, right? You do something for so long and everyone gets used to it and you change it again and nobody likes it anymore. But I think that's really what happened is they got moved out of a practical reason and they weren't able to move it back.
And going off of that, Did they follow the original Frank Lloyd Wright plans for the masonry work?
Yes. I mean, they were pretty exact. It does, and people have compared it, but they did a good job imitating it. So it's a much more maybe Asian view of reconstruction where you're imitating it if you're not using the original materials. I did read, I think it was in Stephen's book, that Marjorie Leahy went back to her old site and there is sort of like rubble around from the old building and that they left a lot of it behind, which is sort of sad, but.
And was there ever any consideration of recreating the Rose Greeley's landscape? I don't know if I pronounced that name correctly.
Yes. You know, honestly, I don't think there has been. Like, I didn't know about it until I can't think of it, where I've got the picture of it. I should go and see if I can see the old one and see what was there, or if I can find better pictures of the garden. But I think no, we have basically the hemicycle that Frank Lloyd Wright sort of shows in his drawing is what is there now. And so it's not this, it's also in defense of the National Trust. And we have a really good person doing our landscape work. When this garden was put in place, Ms. Leahy was spending hours every day there working on it. And so the idea that we could be doing the same is a little bit unrealistic. And so I think we have a very, like we looked at the original palette and we have a very natural landscape that sort of, that emulates what was designed by Frank Lloyd Wright rather than what was designed by Rose Greeley.
And who actually decided what the house was called, Pope-Leighey or both?
So it was the Pope house while the Popes had it, and then it was during this big move. It was actually I'm assuming it's a National Trust because in the paperwork they started discussing it as the Pope-Leighey house. So I think it's because I mean without Marjorie Leahy we wouldn't have it. Without Lauren, they're both so important. Lauren Pope was the one who commissioned it, and it was his baby basically. But without the stewardship of Marjorie Leahy, we would never have it. And so we're indebted to them both equally, which is why the names get married.
Lots of questions coming in. Were there any of Wright's middle-class housing principles used in future housing developments that you know of?
Yes, the answer is yes. And I'm not going to know the name of it, but I've been on a panel. There's somebody there will know. There's a community, I think in New York, of all small Smithsonians. It's like a neighborhood of them.
There's a small development in Pleasantville, but the bigger thing is going to be the Eichler houses in California, where Eichler lived in a Wright house and then fell in love with the idea and built his mid-century California moderns.
Ashley, this is Susan. I have a question for you. So this one goes more to your personal feelings about things. So, and honestly, I could listen to you speak about this insider's perspective all day. So I do want to know, in your personal life, at what point in your life did the twin bugs of architecture and preservation bite you? And is there one over the other that you think is your true love?
Thank you, Susan. That's nice. I don't think I can. Sometimes I try to separate being an architect from being a preservation architect, but no, I am a rare person that as a little kid, and I grew up in Florida where there's like no there, but I grew up in this town called Ormond Beach. I don't know if anyone's familiar with it. And it was actually on Flagler's railroad line. So it did have like a few buildings from 1905 to 1910. I was in love with that period. Like as a little kid, like old buildings. And I grew up in the 80s and the 70s, and there was nothing good being built in Florida, nothing. And Florida was being built like crazy. So the strip mall, like I couldn't imagine being an architect and designing a strip mall or a hospital or a NASCAR center. And I just love the way old buildings make you wonder about a different time. So I was just a rare person that I went to architecture school I knew I wanted to be an architect in high school. I went to architecture school to study preservation. And now that I'm in my 50s and I've only worked in preservation, I do find that design has gone into a much better place. Like I feel like there's good modern design now where there wasn't so much. And I do really like the marriage of preservation and good new design. But for me, it's one and the same. I like being a preservation architect. I like understanding all these, I mean, besides the social, cultural background of the buildings, I really like understanding archaic building materials and how they work and how they fail. They all fail pretty much the same way, but I like the problem solving that comes with being a preservation architect.
Beautiful, thanks. Trinity, do we have more questions? We've got a couple minutes. We might have lost Trinity. Okay, so let's see what another one. Did we answer this? Did the long cantilevers over the ends of the house have a functional purpose, or was this more of a decorative flourish?
I think of them as providing shade. And I think of them as sort of part of that sort of horizontality of Frank Lloyd Wright, sort of bringing you out into the landscape. But actually, I want to go back. It just occurred to me. I wanted to go back to something sort of in the end of it, which is when I was doing this research, I really was thinking that Pope-Leighey House might have been the first modern building saved, like in the preservationist world, because Falling Water was open to the public a year before Pope-Leighey was, but it wasn't saved in the sense of it came down into a family. The parents built it, the son gave it to a conservancy and opened it to the public. But Roby House actually has been saved a couple times, which is another Frank Lloyd Wright building in Chicago. And it was saved in the 40s and then again in the 50s. So this doesn't, I really did think this was going to be it, but it is not. But I wanted to bring up that concept of like how fascinating it is to save these buildings that are not old. Like he's such an important architect and everybody recognized that these buildings are so different that they made people like me want to save them.
Added another criteria. So perhaps for the last question, we have this one from our beloved Ann Thornton. Regarding the words you use to describe the house, warm, honest, human. To this day, so many Americans have never had the experience about how it feels to be in a house like that. Certainly not at an affordable price point as intended. And I might add, may not even have felt what it feels like to be warm and human, or be treated as human. So how might this have changed?
Wow, that's a hard question. I feel like the country's looking at this in so many different directions, right? Like how do we let the human spirit live the best lives it can live? And I'm all with Frank Lloyd Wright. Like if you can have your own space that brings out the better qualities of you by being connected to the world around you, all of our buildings should be like that. I don't think they are. We're struggling with this homelessness and we're struggling with these other things, but it's so nice to have a utopian example out there for us to strive and understand better so we can all work our way into making our homes even nicer.
So that actually ends on a note that is one of the key messages I've learned from Ashley, and that is why we have these places. And she's talked quite a bit about so many of our places, and they are to be something, in large part, to be something to strive toward, so that we now have an idea of what things can be. So Ashley, with that, I just want to let everyone know we do have about 5 or 6 other questions, and what we can do is send those to Ashley. She'll answer all the questions, and then we can post it online. We will post this link online. The Stephen Reese link, as you all remember, those of you who saw that presentation, it broke up because the Zoom call dropped in the middle. So we will give you the fragments of what we did get, and then we will also ask Stephen back on, as we often do, to talk about Pope-Leighey further. And so with that, please do reach out to us at any time if you have other questions you want to add. And thank you from the bottom and the top of all of our hearts, Ashley. We're just thrilled that it was you that gave us this presentation and sure brightened our Sundays. Thank you all for joining, and thanks especially to Ashley.